Okay. So we're actually going to begin this talk with a very short exercise. So you don't need to come into full meditative posture here, but just make sure you're in a comfortable place. Close your eyes. And I want you to consider for a moment this question. Who am I? When you hear those three words in question form, what kind of things start popping into the head? Who am I? And as certain words and images, perhaps memories arise, just observe them. Good, and then you can slowly open the eyes back up. So an interesting question. Who am I? Before we get into that, or to look at that from a slightly different perspective, we're going to rewind a bit and pretend like we were just born. So all the way back to birth. I don't know if you guys remember anything about being born. I certainly do not. Probably that's a good thing. But, just theoretically, picture that you've just been born. So if you were asked that question then, or now that you've just been born, how would you answer? So I assume that most of you would not really have been able to answer that question because you probably couldn't speak the moment that you were born. You probably couldn't even understand language yet. So, answering that question would have been pretty difficult. But, over time, the brain starts to develop and the synapses start connecting, and eventually you start to interpret things that are going on around you. You're usually there's other humans around you while you're going through this very early stage of life, and they're talking and saying things and moving around, and you probably, as the brain develops, you start to pick up on patterns with what's happening around you. So, one of these patterns that's a very critical part of our experience is sound, is hearing. And as you begin to hear all these different vibrations of air molecules and stuff, perhaps you start to notice that there's one particular vibration, one particular sound that that a lot of people are starting to make around you. And maybe you start to notice things about their behavior, and you see that whenever they make this sound, they're kind of referring to you, to this new sort of awareness that's been born. And so, maybe eventually you figure out that is your name. Right? Most of us are given a name from early on, and then that name is sort of passed around and surrounded by us our whole early life. And what this whole sort of point of this idea of a name is that it gives you an identity. You identify with this name. Now the word identify, kind of an interesting one. It comes from the Latin root idem and facere, which basically idem means same, and facere is like to make. So to make the same. In this case, with your name, it would be or with anything really. It's to identify is to make the same as you. So now your name is you, and you are your name. And this is kind of the very beginning of what one of my favorite mindfulness teachers named Ram Dass, what he calls somebody training. This thing that starts from a very young age where we start to become somebody. We start to train to be somebody. And usually a lot of this is done externally by the things in our environment. And so, whenever as we start to grow a little bit older, we start to hear the sound around us, and we start to feel that we understand ourselves. We start to feel like, okay, this is me, this sound, people are saying this, I respond to this. And then eventually we start to pick up on other words and sounds that are going on and what those might mean. And then, eventually maybe we even make some of those sounds ourselves. Start repeating the sounds, repeating what's in our environment around us. So I'm not 100% sure if this is true, but I think I was told once that my first word, I think a lot of people, their first word that they say is usually like mama or dada or some sort of important character in their life. I believe my first word was pasta, which, coming from a family with an Italian background, I think they were probably quite proud of that, or I don't know, maybe disturbed, I'm not sure. Pasta did become an important part of my life, so it's interesting that was my first word. But that's amazing. Now I can say pasta. Now I can communicate whenever I want pasta. And so, I'm starting to learn more about this world and how to navigate it. And there's already something kind of interesting happening here. So, words, these things that are just so a part of our everyday experience from such a young age, we don't usually think too much about it. We just say, yeah, words, communication is important, it's human. And words are beautiful. Like they allow us to communicate. They allow us to collaborate with each other. They allow us to categorize things, and all of these things are awesome. But something that we don't consider too often is the limitations of words. So a word is attempting to describe an object that is infinitely complex. And somebody's name is the best example of this. Like, how can a few syllables, a few vibrations of air molecules possibly define this being, this complex being that is, a human? Or even pasta, pasta's complex. There's a lot of pastas out there. There's a lot of shapes. Every pasta is a little unique. And we categorize everything. We just lump it into this one thing in our mind when we use a word to describe it. So, words are interesting. But there's another aspect of this too. So as you grow older, eventually you're going to see yourself in a mirror. And you're going to notice, and even before you see yourself in a mirror, you're going to notice that you have this body, right? We have this nervous system, and we're getting all these signals all the time, and we're moving it around. And then maybe you see a mirror at some point, and you kind of connect that reflection of light is showing what your body looks like. And so once again, maybe by this point you've already heard of a couple of other people with the same name, and so you're thinking, okay, well, my name doesn't fully identify me, but this body is incredibly unique, right? Like everybody has a very different body in some sense, and this body must be me. And you start to identify with it, right? Make it the same. You are your body. And so this is, once again, useful in many contexts. And, well, actually just a quick story on this one as well. So, I don't really remember that moment of first seeing myself in a mirror or something like that either. But one of my earliest memories, it's actually, I suppose it doesn't really count. It's not my personal memory, but a memory that my mom had this little book that she wrote down some like funny stuff that all of her kids did when they were at a young age. And apparently when I was quite young, shortly after I learned how to speak and move, I guess, I was in some kind of situation, and I really loved I learned how to do a somersault, like a little roll on the ground. And I was so proud of myself for being able to just roll my body across the ground. And I think one of the first like sentences that my mom ever wrote in this book was look what I can do. You should put me in the circus. I already wanted to be in the circus at such a young age because I could roll across the floor. And so, another interesting thing is happening there, right? Like I'm using my body, I'm feeling my body, and then I'm already, from such a young age, starting to tell myself a story in my head. This story of, I should be in the circus, or even more simple than that, like, I can somersault, I can do this thing with my body, this source of pride. And so, these stories, of course, are words. They're made up of words that are sort of strung throughout our heads, words that I spoke aloud as well. And oftentimes these stories, they kind of tell us about either something that happened in the past or something that we want to happen in the future. Of course, words can describe the present moment as well, but the stories in our mind are usually past-based or future-based. And stories have a very repetitive nature. We've probably all heard stories in our minds repeated over and over and over again about certain things, and the more that we hear these stories, the deeper they kind of ingrain themselves in them, and eventually we identify so closely with them that we call them truth. And then oftentimes a big aspect of these stories is this idea of comparison, because we start to look around and we have this ability to see how one thing is different from another. And so, we say, maybe I see somebody else somersaulting and I think, wow, I'm way better at somersaulting than them. I must be good at somersaulting. And I see a bunch more people somersault and I confirm that belief. So now a part of my identity is not only that I'm good at somersaulting, it's that I'm actually better than a lot of people at somersaulting. I haven't verified this recently. I haven't done many somersaults, but I'm pretty good at somersaulting, right? So these stories, they kind of get compared to each other, and then, let's say that this had become like a really strong part of my identity, and I had gone out and tried out for the circus, and then suddenly there's this whole process where I'm being judged, right? I have to do my somersaults, my acts in front of people, and maybe I go and I do that, and then they look at me and they say, yeah, you know what, you're pretty good. Come on to the circus. Come join the circus. And so now I'm a circus performer, right? Now I've got a job. I've got a career. And this becomes another thing that I identify with. This somebody training continues. And I have this role that I can play now of being a circus performer. And of course, being in the circus, there's a couple of things that I need. I need some balls to juggle. I need a nice fancy costume. So I buy these things, or they give them to me, and I have these items, these material things, and I really love them. Like my costume's amazing. It's super cool, and I love it. So I identify with it. Like it becomes something that I own, a material possession, right? So throughout this whole process, I am finding myself, right? I'm starting to understand who I am. I'm someone who's good at moving their body. I can be in the circus. I can perform in front of people and amaze them and whatever. And all of this identification with all of these things, they start to form this picture of myself in my mind and also in the minds of others to some extent. And this picture, this storyline, we call an ego. So, this is very human. This is not really a process that you can, especially nowadays, sort of stop or alter in any significant way, especially when you're younger. An ego will form, and the ego can be super helpful for a number of reasons. But there is an issue with ego. There are a lot of issues with ego, but the one that we're going to talk about today primarily is that the ego thrives on stability, right? Because you've been telling yourself these stories for a long time, they become these truths, and then you want it to stay that way. You create this worldview that represents the way that things are. And, if that worldview gets disturbed, then it starts to crumble. And this really can set us up for a lot of suffering. So, in the case of my career as a circus performer, what happens when the circus tent catches on fire and burns down and all of my stuff is gone, right? Like maybe I can replace these things, but then, I don't know, COVID comes in and the circus shuts down and suddenly there's no circus anymore. Nobody can even leave their houses. So, who am I? And I think actually COVID's a good example. This COVID acted as this very interesting time for a lot of people where they started to think like, who am I really? Well, what am I doing here? And so the key here is that the ego is fragile. And the ego is formed through this identification, through this making things the same as me. And really, when you think about it, you don't need something as extreme as COVID to happen. Everything is constantly changing. Everything has the ability to change. Even the most core concept, even your name can change, right? Usually that's more of an intentional thing. And I know from experience, I actually changed my name maybe 8 years ago. And it's a very interesting thing to reflect on now, why I did that. I was actually born Kolin with a C, and now I'm Kolin with a K. And I legally changed it. And, looking back, I felt a little bit out of place being named Kolin with a C. And I didn't really understand why at the time. Now I think it's just that I felt out of place in life in general. And I thought that changing something as fundamental as my name could kind of give me a fresh start. And so I did that. But what I didn't really realize at the time is that changing the spelling of my name by one letter was almost playing to the ego even more. It was actually developing this new ego that was Kolin with a K, who was this new, different person that now exists. And now I would say I'm happy being Kolin with a K, but it's part of my ego, and I have to remember that sometimes. So for those who didn't figure this out, I did not become a circus performer. I became a meditation teacher. So actually, in preparing for this talk, I had a little bit of a crisis because I was thinking through this concept of ego and, this concept of roles and all of the different things, right, that we just went over. Name, body, stories, comparisons, material possessions, but really this concept of roles, because it's so important in our life these days. Like, what's the first question, especially in the US or in Europe, that anybody asks you when you meet them? What do you do? What's your role in society? That's what we all want to know about each other. So it becomes a very strong part of us. So I was thinking like, okay, well, now I'm writing this talk. I'm thinking about these topics very deeply. How do I write a Dharma talk without being a meditation teacher, like without playing the role of meditation teacher? And this really gave me some pause, and then I thought about it, and I talked to a couple people about it, and I kind of realized that the whole idea with the ego in general, and especially with roles, is that it's perfectly okay to play roles. We do it all of the time. We have to do it all of the time. I like to think of the example of like, so obviously, we need some sort of way to support ourselves, and let's say we choose to do that with a job for somebody to hire us. And if somebody's hiring us and they call us into an interview and, they ask you like, well, what are your skills and your qualifications? And you just say, I'm nobody. I'm one with the universe, or something like that. I'm probably not going to get the job. You're not going to support yourself, right? There's certain times where we need to play the ego game. Many times. And so really the key to this is not, can we just separate and can we just have no roles? Can we just be everybody and all things at once? It's more, can we be aware of what our roles are and when we're playing them. So about a year ago, Anna and I got interviewed on this mindfulness podcast, and the host, he asked us before the podcast to prepare a list of like the 5 most important roles that we play in our life, and then the 5 most important roles that we want to step into. And at first I thought this was kind of strange. It's like, well, yeah, I don't want to, like, I immediately was like sniffing it as a mindfulness teacher, being like, I don't want to be associated with a role. Like, this is interesting that he makes his guests do that. But then actually thinking about it further, I sort of realized it's quite an interesting exercise, because it makes you stop and think, what are the roles that I'm playing? And it wasn't like super easy. I had to sit there for a few minutes and really think about it. And so that alone was sort of evidence of maybe I don't like fully understand how I'm navigating my life right now. And so really I think what is, an interesting way to think about it is, can you stay conscious of what role you're playing, and can you fluidly move between different roles? Almost like if you were an actor, right? You're in Hollywood and you're doing 3 different movie shoots at once, and you need to be transitioning between these different characters, right? Most actors probably don't actually think that they are that character when they're playing it. Maybe they convince themselves they do if they're acting really well. But the point is, they step off the set and they're kind of back to another role, which is, probably a different role that they're playing in life. But the point is, can you play the different roles in your life like an actor? Understand where they're necessary, use them as they will, and then let them go when you don't need them. So an example of when you might not need a role, I've been doing this meditation teacher thing for a few years now, and I've definitely had to be careful, because especially when I first got into it, I started to learn all these amazing things, and I started to, help some people and really like see some results. And so then I thought, wow, I'm a meditation teacher, cool. So then when, somebody from my family or one of my friends came to me and they needed something from me, then like immediately I became the meditation teacher. And it was like, oh, you're having this issue? You tried meditating? Yeah. And then that was like the only thing I could talk about for a couple of years, because it was my framework, it was my role. And so, I think it's taken me time to realize that sometimes my role with somebody is just to be a friend, or just to be a colleague, just to be a coworker that doesn't need to join the meditation program at work. And then I've also realized though that you don't need to overcorrect. Like sometimes there is a time to be a meditation teacher, like right when you're writing a Dharma talk, or most importantly when you're at a retreat or something like this. Like this is when I play that role. So this concept of identification, especially when we talk about the meditative journey, the meditative path, it can get kind of tricky, because what a lot of us do is we sort of get into this stuff and we think, wow, this is amazing. I'm meditating. I'm doing these different spiritual practices, and so I'm a spiritual person, and I take care of myself. And you kind of tell yourself that story, and then what happens? Same as everything else. You start to identify with it. You start to identify as being someone who takes care of themselves, who's really healthy, right? Eats healthy all the time, whatever. But the issue is that what happens when you're in a situation where for some reason you can't be healthy and you can't take care of yourself, where things get really extreme and you lose the ability to do so? What happens? Your entire perception of yourself can crumble. So it's really important to notice, when are you identifying with things? How are you identifying with things? And it starts with awareness. And now when the ego actually begins to break down, when we have, some crisis of identity or something, what the ego likes to do is kind of restore that hole, that crack with something else, to like re-identify with something else to strengthen itself again. And I think a good example of this is this concept that we have of the midlife crisis, right? Where it's like people get to the middle of their lives sometimes and they think like, oh shit, like I have no idea what I'm doing. I've been working this job that I don't even like, and things aren't great with my family or whatever it is. And you go and you do all this work and you change all these things up, and then suddenly you're in a new role. You're in a new place, and maybe it's a little bit of a healthier place, and if it is, that's awesome. But you're just creating a new role most of the time, unless maybe you become a monk and you learn about all these concepts. But you know, it's something to consider. So the ego really, it's never satisfied. It's always more, more, more. What is the next step? What is the next thing I need to accomplish, to do? So much of this doing that we spoke about in the earlier talk comes from this ego, this egoic need to progress. And you know, we can see this in all aspects of ego. I think, like for me, like a big thing has been throughout my life has been material possessions. I'm someone who really like loves having nice, high quality gear, especially when it comes to surfing and mountain climbing and the stuff that I like to do. And I identify with those things. And when something happens to them, I get quite upset. I have had more than one not so pleasant reaction when a surfboard had a broke, and I realized that, you know, I wasn't going to be able to fix it, or that it was going to be expensive or time consuming. And so this is all the ego. It's this identification. And it's this, and also just this wanting more. It's like, I love having more gear, and Anna makes fun of me all the time because of how many surfboards I have, but there's always like, oh, what if I had another board for this one specific type of wave and this one specific type of condition? So there's always more that you can have. And you know, in fact, we have an entire industry. We have an entire thing called marketing that is dedicated to sort of convincing people that they need more of something, oftentimes when they don't really need it. And so what does this actually lead to? I mean, on a societal level, we're seeing it play out. Like this is the base of capitalism. Like capitalism is literally the foundation of capitalism is growth. It's growth at all costs. It's continue growing. And we take this into our spiritual practice. We got to keep growing, keep getting better and better. And you know, what is that? I always think it's so funny, this concept of GDP, like that we all just think is so normal. And it's like, you know, GDP is fine, okay, like track how an economy is doing is great, but like the fact that, at least in the US, if we have a year where the economy is still growing, but it's growing at a slower rate than the year before, it's like a huge failure, and the markets start to crash because you're growing at a slower rate. And so it's interesting to just kind of zoom out and think about all this. Like where is this all coming from? Where, you know, with society, there's kind of this collective ego that needs to keep growing, and we're all feeding into it with our individual egos. So, cool. Now we know a little bit about the ego. What do we do about it? Right? How can we approach this topic, especially at a meditation retreat, especially with this practice that we've been learning? So, the answer might not surprise you. The answer is quite simply, we practice. We practice these methods, these things that we've been talking about already. And what the practice allows us to do is to temporarily simulate a place where we don't need to identify with things, right? What do we do with the sounds? We hear the sound, we don't label it. You know, eventually we get into the thoughts. What do you do with the thoughts? The thought is there, but we don't identify it. It's just a sound, right? So can we just hear the sounds? Can we just watch the thoughts? Can we just feel the sensations in the body and not identify, not tell a story, not think about the 5 injuries that were causing that thing? And you know, I've been there. I know it's very difficult, but it gives us this time to try to release the identification, release the judgment. And you know, one thing that you start to notice as you do this more and more is that all of these things that make up the ego, all of these things that we identify with, they're constantly coming and going, right? Impermanent, as the Buddhists say. Always, 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 no matter what. The most intense emotion of all time will not last your whole life. It will fade and it will be replaced by something else. And so we notice this in the practice, and then we use this at other points in our life where we may feel like something is so overwhelming that we can't deal with it. And I really like this one quote from Veronika Tugaleva, which says, "To know yourself, you must sacrifice the illusion that you already do." Right? So this idea is to know yourself beyond the ego. You need to see through this illusion of ego. And Mr. Eckhart Tolle actually has a really nice quote about illusion, which plays in quite well, which is that if you can recognize illusion as illusion, it dissolves. The recognition of illusion is also its ending. Its survival depends on you mistaking it for reality. So there it is, right? If we accept that the ego is this illusory thing, this illusion that's constantly changing, that we can change, that our environment can change, then all we need to do to sort of remind ourselves of this fact is to see it, to recognize on a regular basis through our practice that it's all up for grabs. It can all change. And one way to kind of remember this is think about a magic trick, right? Like, what's so cool about a magic trick? Like, we love to be sort of fooled sometimes. We love this concept of illusions. And a magic trick is exactly that. It's some sort of way of tricking your brain into, believing in something. And it's so cool when you have no idea how it happened, when the magician, does some crazy thing and you're like, wow. But what happens when, you go behind stage after and talk to the magician and he tells you exactly how he did it? The magic is gone, quite literally, right? The illusion is broken because you know how it functions and it's no longer mysterious. And so that's not to say that we don't want some aspects of our life to be mysterious. There's a lot of beauty in mystery and in not knowing. But when it comes to the ego, there's a lot of beauty with knowing, with understanding where our ego is and how it's affecting us. So the more you practice this in enclosed space here, the more that you practice in the simulation of non-identification, the more you will start to see areas of your life outside of the practice where you're identifying. The more you'll start to recognize situations. And it doesn't happen quickly. There's kind of this concept that I call the mindful gap, which is important here, which is that when you start to notice something in your life, let's say you have issues with anger, and you really notice that this one person, let's say it's somebody from your family, when they start to talk about this one topic, you get really angry, right? And let's say you're sitting here in meditation and you kind of have some sort of realization about that. You're like, oh, okay, cool. So actually I want to kind of start to notice in my regular life when this person speaks, I get angry. Now, the first few times that they speak to you, you're probably going to forget, and you're probably going to get a bit angry. And there's going to be this space of time, the gap, the mindful gap between when the thing happens and when you're going to have all this reaction, and then you're going to eventually, hopefully, have a more thoughtful response of maybe reflecting a bit and being like, you know what, I didn't need to be so angry there. And the first time it's going to be like this, and then maybe the second time it takes you longer. But then eventually, over time, as you continue to practice, this gap shrinks. And the idea is that eventually, you're actually sort of catching yourself in these unideal moments, these places where you want to change and be better. You're catching yourself almost instantaneously. And eventually that is how the change is actually made. Right? So there might be this misconception sometimes that once you identify something in your life, or once you notice something in your life, and then it's just like, oh, I can change it immediately. No, there's this space, there's this time, and you have to be patient. You have to give it time so that you can continuously recognize it. And actually, this idea of continuous recognition, I think it's quite interesting that one of the words that is used to refer to mindfulness, oftentimes, when I believe it's a Pali word, satori, actually translates to remember. The practice of mindfulness is to remember. So think about that for a moment. What are we remembering while we practice? Well, it could be many things, but in this case, we're remembering to be mindful. We're remembering to come back to the present moment, to notice where and when we want to improve our situation. Constantly remembering, shrinking that gap. And so, at the end of the day, you don't need to get rid of the ego. I think that's another kind of misconception amongst people who maybe go very deep down this path. They think, wow, like, this is so amazing. I'm having these experiences of intense bliss where the whole, they're literally called ego death experiences, right? Maybe you take a bunch of mushrooms, or maybe you sit on a meditation retreat for a month and you completely lose your ego for a temporary period of time and you feel one with everything around you. This is very possible. It's very beautiful. I've experienced it many times, and for a long time in my own practice, I kind of thought that was it. I thought that was the goal. I thought the goal was to just keep having these experiences until my normal life resembled this egoless state. But really, the more that I get into this, I'm starting to realize it's not about that. Once again, can you be aware of the ego in any moment? You don't need to sit on a meditation retreat for a month. You don't need to do a bunch of mushrooms. You can, in any moment, be aware of your ego and what your ego is doing. It just requires your focus and your attention on the present moment. And every time that you recognize where the ego is acting in your life, but you don't give it power, you don't just unconsciously follow it, the ego diminishes a little bit. It needs attention to thrive. It needs you to be unconsciously lost in it, feeding it for it to thrive. And so, as we kind of slowly find out more and more about this ego, we start to get closer to this question of who I am. And there's a really nice quote also from Eckhart Tolle about this. He says, "You are not the ego. So when you become aware of the ego in you, it does not mean you know who you are. It means you know who you are not. But it is through knowing who you are not that the greatest obstacle to truly knowing yourself is removed." So I want to just take 1 minute to go back into that exercise that we did at the beginning. Just closing the eyes for a moment. And I ask you again to consider the question, who am I? And maybe as you consider this, you have a lot of thoughts running around in the head. Very common, but see if there's anything underneath. See if there's any more subtle feeling to the consideration of that question. Good, and then you can slowly open the eyes. And I'm sure that there are some interesting things that just happened to you there, but I want to just remind you that we're very, very heavily conditioned from literally since birth to identify and to build this ego. So when you first really wholeheartedly embrace this concept, think about this concept, it can definitely make you feel a little bit lost. I've felt very lost, actually, the last week or two just thinking about this concept and this talk. But, what always kind of brings me back is just remembering that when I fight against the ego, when I try and change it too quickly or change it intentionally, it actually makes it stronger. So, what the classic saying, what you resist persists. It'll make it stick around a lot longer, and it'll be a lot more obvious. And so, notice when you're grasping to these concepts of your ego. Notice when you're obsessing about it too much. And practice. Practice being in this place where you can see it, and then bring that into the rest of your life. And the more you do this, the more you repeat this over and over and over again, the less power the ego and all of these roles and all of these possessions and these people and comparisons and everything, the less power those things will have over you. So remember, you never need to be free of the ego, or you never will be fully free of the ego. However, in every single moment, you can identify it and find out who you actually are. So with that, we'll just maybe take a couple more minutes, closing the eyes, to consider all of these words and whatever they bring up for you.